Hello everyone, welcome to today's class. The topic for today's lecture is specific performance of contracts. It's a very interesting topic and basically it deals with contract law, but it also deals with a law called Specific Relief Act, which has been enacted uh, on the principles of the law of equity. Now let us first understand what do you mean by law of equity? Well, law of equity means when a particular law, enacted law, fails to address a particular ambiguity which is to the detriment of one particular party, and under that enacted law, when the relief is inadequate or cannot address that ambiguity or the uh, issue fully, that is where equity sets in, and the law of equity is required to in fact uh, reinstate parity and provide relief to the aggrieved party. And this is law of equity which has evolved from English law, the courts of chancery in England a couple of centuries back. And in India, under the law of contract, many a times relief cannot be adequate or cannot fully compensate the aggrieved party. And that is why in 1963, this law known as Specific Relief Act was enacted. Under the Specific Relief Act, aggrieved party can petition the court for specific performance of a contract. Now, we know that in a contract, both the parties have their obligations to perform. When one of the parties fail to perform its obligation, that is known as breach of contract. Now, against breach, there could be damages that could be awarded by the court, but in some instances it may so happen that damages or monetary compensation may not be the adequate relief for the aggrieved party, and the aggrieved party wants nothing but performance of the contract, for the other party to perform its part of the contract. So that is where the law of specific relief under the equity principle, in fact that is how this law has evolved, and this provides adequate relief to aggrieved party. So that is what we are going to learn today. Five primary learnings is, of course, what do you mean by specific performance of contract, and when can specific performance be enforced by the court under the Specific Relief Act? What are the instances when courts cannot specifically enforce performance of a contract? Then obviously what would be the defense? The defendant would have the defense of repudiation of the contract itself. That is not under specific relief, but of course specific relief says that all the grounds by way of which the contract can be repudiated can be pleaded by the defendant. That is under section 9 of the Specific Relief Act. And one must always remember that any remedy under the principles of equity or under law of equity are discretionary remedies. You can't plead or pray for those remedies as a matter of right. So it is up to the discretion of the court. So exactly in the same way, awarding specific performance of the contract is up to the discretion of the court. So these are the five main learnings from today's lecture that we are going to look at. So I have already explained what do you mean by specific performance, but I will illustrate it even further. So take one instance where you have entered into a sale agreement for buying a flat, an apartment, next door to the apartment where your brother is staying in some neighborhood of Pune city, let's assume, and your brother is staying with your parents, so you want to buy the next door flat which is now available for sale because you want to live next door to your with your brother, and of course you will also be able to every day see your parents, or even your parents can move into your house whenever they want to. So all those kind of arrangements can be had, provided the seller who has shown the interest to sell and who has entered into an agreement for sale with you sells the flat. But at some point in time, the seller backs out and he says that you have mind well, you have also performed your part of the obligations under the contract, such as payment of full consideration. But last moment, the seller backs out and the seller says that, he doesn't want to sell the flat anymore to you. Now you are really devastated by this decision and you don't want to do anything, but you want the flat at any cost. So you approach the court under this law called Specific Relief Act for specific performance of the contract, wherein you want the courts to enforce the contract and enforce the seller to perform his obligation of transferring the flat in your name and providing you the peaceful possession of the flat. So this is a perfect instance of uh, a contract where specific performance, or to make you understand what do you mean by specific performance. Another example could be that one of your grandfather's friend has some old paintings of your grandfather who is no more, and you want to buy those paintings from your grandfather's friend. So you have offered a sum of money to the person, and the person has entered into a contract to sell those paintings to you, but again at the last moment decides to back out from the deal and doesn't want to sell the paintings. Now those paintings are such that you cannot really estimate any, they are priceless for you because of your grandfather's memory and all of that. So there is a lot of emotional quotient or emotional attachment to those paintings. So there is no really particular monetary value that you can ascribe to the paintings. So when the person backs out of the deal, you want to approach the court for the relief that you want the court to enforce specific performance of that contract by the grandfather's friend who is owning the paintings or who is having the paintings right now. Those were gifted to him by your grandfather. So these are typically the best examples one can give of when the contract can be specifically performed. So basically, when you can't really, when monetary compensation cannot fully, in money value, you cannot really compensate the aggrieved party, and that is number one. And in fact, when the contract is such that basically the damages cannot be fully quantified in terms of money, that is the most important, these are the two most important points that we need to understand. At the same time, we should also understand that there are two important presumptions concerning property under the Specific Relief Act. Those presumptions are under section 10, and under those presumptions, the first presumption says that if the contract is in relation to immovable property, then there is a presumption that compensation for non-performance of the contract cannot be adequate in terms of money. That is the first presumption. And the second presumption is that if the contract is in relation to a movable property, then the compensation for non-performance of such contract can be adequate in terms of money. So these are the two important presumptions that are provided under the section 10, and we need to very clearly be mindful of this, because if you are going for specific performance of a contract for movable property, then court will definitely not be inclined to order specific performance, because damages or monetary compensation will be a adequate compensation. But if it is a contract for immovable property, then courts will definitely be inclined towards specific performance. So you have to be mindful of these two assumptions, or rather presumptions. Now we should also understand which are those contracts specifically provided under the Specific Relief Act. Section 14 provides for 4 different types of contracts, where those contracts, the courts will not be inclined to order specific performance, and those have been very clearly defined. The first species of such contracts are where money provides adequate relief. If the court is satisfied that money can provide adequate relief, court will not want to order specific performance. Now in the two instances or examples that I gave you, one was about the flat that you want to buy in Pune neighborhood next door to your brother's flat. So there no amount of monetary compensation can give you that relief unless you get a possession and ownership of the next door flat. So where compensation in money provides adequate relief, court will not be inclined to order specific performance. Again, where contract runs into minute or numerous details, typically contract for personal services, or let's say for some kind of a personal attendant, those kind of contracts are some contracts where they require performance of minute and numerous things, and court will not get into what can be performed and what cannot be performed. So court will simply say that there is a clear exclusion of under section 14(1)(b) of the Specific Relief Act, and court will not be inclined to consider specific performance of such kind of a contract. The third species is a contract which is a determinable contract. What is a determinable contract? The determinable contract is a contract where either of the parties to the contract can terminate the contract at their will by giving notice and without giving any reason for termination of such contract. So those kind of contracts are called determinable contracts. So no specific performance can be ordered if the contract is a determinable contract. This is section 14(1)(c). And then we have section 14(1)(d), which says that contracts which require performance of a continuous duty that the court cannot supervise, even such contracts will not be considered for specific performance. So for example, again, personal contracts of personal employment where there are too many duties and obligations imposed on a particular worker or a maid or somebody, then they cannot, and if those contracts are terminated, those aggrieved parties cannot demand specific performance or reinstatement of their employment, say on the ground of specific performance. Courts will be inclined to award damages because of the exclusion specifically provided under section 14(1)(d) of the Specific Relief Act. Needless to mention that the defendant in any suit for specific performance can always repudiate the contract. This is provided by section 9 of the Specific Relief Act. And which are those grounds for repudiation of the contract? Incapacity of party to have entered into the contract, uncertainty. These all the grounds are there under the contract law. They have not been specifically mentioned under Specific Relief Act, but Specific Relief Act section 9 says that a person against whom the relief is claimed may plead by way of defense following grounds, and those grounds are all under identical as mentioned in the contract law. So these grounds are incapacity of parties, uncertainty of contract, absence of concluded contract, fraud, misrepresentation, mistake, illegality or lack of authority to enter into a contract. And final point that I want to make is that the remedy of specific performance is discretionary. It is not a mandatory right of the plaintiff to demand specific performance. The court has to be fully satisfied that the plaintiff coming to the court is coming with clean hands. At the same time, if the court is satisfied, or rather the court has evidence on record that the defendant is not clean, and if the defendant has tried to mislead the court, then the remedy of specific performance should not be denied to the plaintiff. That is what the Supreme Court of India has held in a 2001 case. So this clearly shows the power of the court and that specific performance is discretionary. That's all for today.